The night my parents asked me to leave my sister's house, it wasn't because I was loud or drunk or causing a scene. It was because I didn't belong anymore. That was the first thing I understood standing in the entryway with my coat half on one shoe, already tied, my youngest daughter asleep against my shoulder. Belonging, I learned that night, was conditional. It was a Saturday in early December, cold enough that the air burned a little when you breathed too deep. My sister Lauren had insisted on hosting an early Christmas dinner at her place in Naperville, one of those big suburban houses with white siding and a porch that only ever got used for photos. She said it would be easier with everyone's schedules. She said it would be nice for the kids. I almost didn't go. At that point, I was 31, recently laid off, newly divorced, and raising 2 kids on my own. My savings were thinning in quiet, terrifying increments. Every grocery trip felt like a math problem. Every night I lay awake calculating time instead of sheep. How many months until the rent ran out? How many favors I could still ask before I had none left? But my mother had called twice. Then my father left a voicemail, short, controlled. "You should come. It's family." So I packed a bag of hand-me-down toys, wrestled my kids into the car, and drove 40 minutes north, telling myself that showing up still mattered. Dinner was already half over when we arrived. Lauren hugged me with one arm, her other hand still holding a wine glass. She smelled like vanilla candles and something sharper underneath. Her husband Mark nodded at me like I was a neighbor, not his sister-in-law of 8 years. My parents were seated at the long dining table, my mother at the head, my father beside her. My brother Ethan leaned back in his chair, scrolling on his phone, his plate already empty. No one stood up when I came in. That should have been my cue. We sat. We ate what was left. My kids picked at their food, overwhelmed by the noise and unfamiliar space. I kept my voice low. I laughed when it was appropriate. I avoided mentioning work or the lack of it. I said I'm figuring things out like it was a complete sentence. About halfway through dessert, Lauren clinked her spoon against her glass. "I just think," she said, smiling too tightly, "that we should be honest as a family." My stomach dropped before she finished the sentence. She went on about responsibility, about choices, about how hard it was to watch someone not help themselves. She never said my name. She didn't have to. Every eye at the table slid toward me, then flicked away like I was something impolite to stare at. My mother cleared her throat. "Lauren's right," she said. "We're worried about you." Worried was her word for disappointed. My father leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You can't expect things to just work out," he said. "You have kids. You need stability." I nodded. I always nodded. It was easier than explaining how hard I was already trying. Then Ethan laughed, just once, short, sharp. "So what's the plan?" he asked. "Move back home, because that's not happening." That was when Lauren finally looked directly at me. "We didn't mean to do this in front of the kids," she said, not lowering her voice at all. "But maybe it's best if you head out early. They're tired, and honestly, this is getting uncomfortable." The word uncomfortable landed heavier than any insult. I looked at my parents. Surely this was the part where one of them would say something, where my mother would wave it off, where my father would change the subject, where someone would remember that I was still their daughter. My mother folded her napkin. "Yes," she said, "that's probably for the best." That was it. No argument, no hesitation, just a quiet agreement that I no longer had a place at the table. I stood up slowly, my face hot, my hands shaking just enough that I had to steady my daughter before she slipped. I said nothing. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I thanked Lauren for dinner like muscle memory, like something programmed into me years ago. As I reached the door, my father added, "You know we love you, but love doesn't mean enabling." I didn't turn around. In the car, my son asked why everyone was mad at me. I told him they weren't. That lie tasted worse than anything else that night. For weeks after, no one called. Christmas came and went without an invitation. A birthday passed unnoticed. When I texted my mother a photo of the kids in the snow, she responded with a thumbs up emoji. Nothing else. That was when the silence stopped feeling accidental. I started to see the pattern I'd missed my whole life. How love had always been transactional. How approval came with rules I was never allowed to read. How being the difficult one in the family meant I was always one mistake away from exile. At night, after the kids fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my laptop. Job listings, legal forms, budget spreadsheets. I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me. I stopped hoping they'd realize what they'd done. Instead, I began making decisions. Small ones at first, then bigger. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know that 2 years later, the same people who had pushed me out the door would be calling me voices unsteady, asking for help they couldn't get anywhere else. All I knew standing in that cold December parking lot was that something inside me had gone quiet. And when that happens, it's usually because something else is waking up. The first month after that night passed in survival mode. I woke before dawn, packed lunches with whatever was left in the fridge, and walked my kids to school because the car needed repairs I couldn't afford yet. I smiled at other parents and avoided eye contact at the same time. At home, I filled out applications until my eyes burned tailoring cover letters that pretended my life hadn't cracked open. I didn't tell anyone what had happened at Lauren's house. Not friends, not coworkers from my old job, not even the neighbor who occasionally watched my kids. Shame thrives in silence, and I wasn't ready to confront it out loud. But silence has a way of clarifying things. I noticed how my phone stayed quiet unless I initiated contact. How my parents' concern, once so vocal, had evaporated the moment it required anything from them. How being unemployed hadn't just lowered my status professionally, it had erased my value within my own family. I replayed the dinner over and over, not the words but the expressions. My mother's calm detachment, my father's measured disappointment, Lauren's relief once I was gone, like she'd removed an eyesore from her carefully arranged home. Ethan's smirk. It wasn't anger I felt, it was something colder, recognition. By January, the money problem became real enough that I stopped pretending otherwise. Rent was due. The heating bill doubled. I sold my wedding ring online, telling myself it was just metal, just a symbol from a life that no longer existed. When the package left my hands at the post office, I felt lighter than I expected. One night after the kids were asleep, I opened a folder I hadn't touched in years. It was labeled Estate, something my parents had shared access to back when they were getting organized. Inside were scanned documents, notes, partial drafts. I hadn't gone looking for them consciously. My mouse just hovered there, then clicked. There was a will, an older version. It listed all three of us equally, nothing special, nothing surprising. But attached was a handwritten note from my grandmother dated just months before she died. It referenced a trust, a separate one I'd never heard of. I stared at the screen for a long time. My grandmother and I had been close. Not the loud, affectionate kind of close, the quiet kind. She watched how people behaved when they thought no one was paying attention. She had once told me, "You don't learn who someone is when things go right. You learn it when they think they're winning." After her funeral, Lauren had handled most of the arrangements. She lived closest. She was better at those things. I had been in the middle of my divorce, then overwhelmed, grateful for the help. I never questioned it. Now I did. The next morning, I called the county records office. I asked about trusts filed under my grandmother's name. The woman on the line was polite but firm. She couldn't give details, but she confirmed something existed. That was enough to unsettle me. I didn't confront anyone. Not my parents. Not Lauren. I didn't ask questions that would alert them. I simply made an appointment with a lawyer whose name I found through a free legal aid clinic. His office smelled like old books and burnt coffee. He listened without interrupting his pen, moving steadily across a yellow pad. When I finished, he leaned back and asked a question that shifted the air in the room. "Did your grandmother ever mention leaving you something separately?" "Yes," I said. "But she said it would only matter if things went a certain way." He nodded slowly. "That's not uncommon." "What does that mean?" "It means she anticipated conflict." He explained options, requests for information, formal letters, the difference between entitlement and documentation. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough to know one thing: if something had been hidden, it had been done intentionally. Walking out of his office, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. At home, my kids did homework at the kitchen table while I cooked pasta. The normalcy of it all felt almost surreal, like I was standing in two timelines at once. In one, I was barely holding things together. In the other, something was quietly aligning. In February, I got a temporary contract job. Not glamorous, not secure, but enough to breathe again, enough to stop checking my bank balance every hour. My parents called once that month. My mother asked how I was doing, her tone careful, distant. I said, "We're fine." It was the truth. She didn't ask follow-up questions. By March, I received a letter. It wasn't from my family. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice acknowledging my inquiry into my grandmother's estate and informing me that certain assets had been placed into a trust that would be reviewed due to potential mismanagement. I sat down hard in the chair. The words mismanagement and review blurred together. My hands trembled, but my mind stayed oddly clear. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was information correcting itself. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer beneath the kids' school papers and grocery receipts. I didn't tell anyone, not even my lawyer yet. I wanted to see how long it would take before the silence broke. It took 3 weeks. My sister called on a Tuesday afternoon. I watched her name light up my phone and let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was bright, too bright. "Hey," she said, "we need to talk." That was when I knew. Whatever had been done without me, whatever assumptions had been made about my weakness, were beginning to shift. And people only reach out like that when they feel the ground move under their feet. Lauren didn't get to decide when we talked. I let her voicemail sit unanswered for 2 days. Then a text came. Casual, almost friendly. "Just checking in. Call me when you have a minute." I didn't respond. On the 3rd day, my mother called. That was new. Her voice carried the careful warmth she used when she wanted something but didn't want to admit it. She asked about the kids. She commented on the weather. She mentioned nothing about Lauren's call, which told me everything. I said I had to go. That night, after the kids were asleep, I reread the letter from the law firm. This time, I called my lawyer. He listened, then exhaled slowly. "That changes the timeline," he said. "Whose timeline?" I asked. "Everyone's." He explained that when a trust is structured the way my grandmother's was, it often included contingencies, safeguards, clauses that only activated under certain conditions. The kind of conditions that required someone to push too hard. "You didn't trigger this," he said, "but your inquiry may have exposed something that was already unstable." I hung up feeling neither guilty nor vindicated, just aware. A week later, Lauren showed up at my apartment. She hadn't been there since I moved in. I didn't invite her. She buzzed the intercom like she still had the right. I looked at her through the peephole before opening the door. Perfect hair, structured coat, the same controlled expression she wore at work events, at PTA meetings, at family dinners where everything had to look seamless. She stepped inside and scanned the space quickly as if inventorying my life. "It's smaller than I thought," she said. I nodded. "What do you want?" She smiled, sat down without being asked, crossed her legs. "We got a letter." There it was. From a law firm, she continued, about Grandma's trust. I stayed standing. She tilted her head. "Did you know about it?" "Yes," I said. Her smile thinned. "Why didn't you tell us?" I considered all the answers I could give, then chose the simplest one. "No one asked." Her fingers tightened around her purse strap. "You didn't think it would be important?" "I thought I said that if it was important to you, you would have included me years ago." She laughed, but it sounded brittle. "That's not fair." "Neither was asking me to leave your house," I said evenly. Her eyes flickered, just for a second. "This isn't about that," she said. "This is about protecting the family." I almost smiled. "From what I asked?" "From chaos," she said. "From misunderstandings. From lawyers getting involved." "They're already involved," I said. She leaned forward. "Look, things have been tense. You've had a hard time. We all know that. But stirring this up doesn't help anyone." "Stirring what up?" I asked a question. "You asked the wrong people," she snapped. Silence settled between us, thick and revealing. She took a breath. "Mom and Dad are worried. They think this could affect the house, the business accounts." "The business," I repeated. Her mouth closed. That was the moment. The slip. I filed it away without reacting. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. She stood abruptly. "We should talk with a mediator, or a family lawyer, just to clarify things." I shook my head. "I'm already represented." Her face hardened. "You didn't have to make this adversarial." I looked at her, then really looked, at the way her concern never extended past what she might lose. At how quickly she framed herself as reasonable, me as disruptive. "You made it adversarial when you decided I didn't belong," I said quietly. She opened the door, then paused. "You're going to regret this." After she left, I locked the door and slid down against it, my breath shallow but steady. Not panic, not fear, anticipation. Over the next month, the tone shifted. Emails, certified letters, phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize. My lawyer handled most of it. He told me only what I needed to know. There were discrepancies. Transfers made without proper authorization. Assets moved between accounts under the assumption that no one would question them. They didn't think you would, he said. My parents stopped calling altogether. In May, I received a subpoena. It wasn't for me. It was for Lauren. The trust was being audited. I watched from a distance as the family narrative unraveled. Not dramatically, quietly. The way things do when they can no longer support their own weight. Ethan tried reaching out once. He sent a text that read, "This is getting blown out of proportion." I didn't respond. I focused on my kids, on my job, which had turned into a full-time offer, on the growing sense that I wasn't fighting anyone anymore. I was simply refusing to step back into a role designed to diminish me. One afternoon, my mother called. Her voice trembled. "We need your help," she said. I closed my eyes. 2 years earlier, they had asked me to leave a dinner table. Now they were asking me to step back into a story they no longer controlled. And for the first time, I understood that helping and rescuing were not the same thing. I told her I would think about it. Then I hung up, because thinking I'd learned was a privilege I was finally allowed to claim. I didn't sleep the night my mother asked for help. Not because I felt torn. That part surprised me. I slept poorly because I was alert in a way I hadn't been before, like my body understood something my heart had already accepted. This wasn't a crisis. It was a reckoning. In the morning, I made breakfast, walked the kids to school, and went to work. I answered emails. I attended a meeting. I took notes. Life kept moving indifferent to my family's sudden urgency. That steadiness grounded me. At lunch, I stepped outside and called my lawyer. "They reached out," I said. He didn't ask who. "What did they say?" "They want help." He was quiet for a moment, then "They're scared." "What do I do?" "You decide what you're willing to do," he said. "And more importantly, what you're not." That afternoon, I received an email from my father. No greeting, no apology, just a request to meet. Neutral ground, coffee shop, Saturday morning. I agreed. When I arrived, they were already seated. My parents sat side by side, closer than usual, like they were bracing together. My mother's hands were folded tightly in her lap. My father stared into his coffee as if it might offer guidance. They both looked older. That observation landed with unexpected weight. Not satisfaction, just fact. My mother smiled when she saw me. It wavered. "Thank you for coming." I sat down. "You said you needed help." My father cleared his throat. "We're in a difficult position." I waited. He continued. "There are questions being asked about your grandmother's estate, about decisions that were made." "By whom?" I asked. My mother flinched. "Lauren handled most of it," my father said carefully. "With our blessing." That was the closest thing to accountability I'd heard so far. My mother reached for my hand, then hesitated, pulling back at the last second. "We never meant for things to go this far." I looked at her. "You meant for me not to matter." Her eyes filled, but she didn't deny it. "We thought you were unstable," she said. "That you needed limits." "Control," I corrected. She nodded once, maybe. My father finally looked up. "The trust review could affect the house," he said. "Our retirement accounts. The business partnership your grandfather started." There it was again, the business. "You want me to stop it," I said. "We want you to cooperate," my mother said quickly. "To clarify your intentions. To tell them there was no wrongdoing." "And was there?" I asked. Silence. That was my answer. "I can't do that," I said. My father's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand perfectly," I said. "I just don't think it's my job to protect you from consequences." My mother's voice rose. "After everything we've done for you," I met her gaze. "You stopped doing things for me the moment I stopped fitting the role you assigned." The words didn't feel cruel. They felt precise. She looked away first. We sat in uncomfortable quiet for a long moment. People laughed at nearby tables. A barista called out names. Life continued oblivious. Finally, my father spoke again. "What do you want?" The question surprised me. Not because he asked it, but because it was the first time he ever had. "I want distance," I said, "and transparency." My mother frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I won't interfere," I said. "But I won't protect anyone either. I won't sign anything. I won't make statements on your behalf. And I won't be involved unless it's through my lawyer." "That's it?" my father asked. "That's it." My mother's shoulders sagged. "You're really going to let this happen?" "I'm going to let the truth happen," I said. When I stood to leave, my father spoke again, softer this time. "You used to need us." I paused. "I needed parents," I said, "not gatekeepers." That night, Lauren called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. Her voice cracked, midway through anger, bleeding into fear. She said the word family 3 times. She said betrayal once. She never said sorry. Over the next weeks, things accelerated. The audit widened. Financial advisors stepped back. A business partner froze accounts pending review. The house my parents lived in, the one we grew up in, was listed as collateral on a loan I'd never known existed. The story they'd told themselves, that they were careful, that they were protecting the family, collapsed under documentation. And through it all, I stayed quiet. I focused on work. I negotiated a raise. I put money into savings for the first time in years. I took my kids on a small weekend trip, nothing fancy, just a cabin and a lake. They laughed more than I'd heard in months. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my lawyer. They want to settle it, read, on terms favorable to you. I stared at the screen, feeling something loosen inside me. This wasn't about revenge, not in the way people imagine it. No shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic reveal. It was about refusing to lie for people who had erased me when it was convenient. And as the tables began to turn, I understood something clearly for the first time. They weren't asking for my help because I was family. They were asking because I finally had something they needed. And that changed everything. The settlement proposal arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I was at my desk halfway through a report when my lawyer forwarded the email with a single line above it. Read carefully, no rush. That alone told me everything. When people say no rush, it's because they're used to urgency working in their favor. I waited until I got home to open it. The kids were in the living room building something elaborate out of mismatched blocks, arguing over whose turn it was to place the roof. I listened to their voices for a moment before sitting down at the kitchen table, grounding myself in the ordinary, before stepping back into the mess I hadn't created. The proposal was long, dense, legal language designed to sound reasonable while conceding as little as possible. In short, they wanted the audit to stop. They wanted the trust released back under family control. They wanted me to sign a statement acknowledging that any irregularities were misunderstandings, not misconduct. In return, they offered me a lump sum payout, not insignificant, enough to be tempting, enough to make it look on paper like fairness. What they didn't offer was the truth. They didn't offer acknowledgement, they didn't offer accountability, and they didn't offer to change anything about the structure that had allowed all of this to happen in the first place. I closed the document and sat there for a long time. 2 years earlier, that amount of money would have felt like rescue. It would have meant safety relief, proof that I still mattered. Now it felt like a test. I called my lawyer. They're trying to buy silence, I said. Yes, he replied, cheaply. What happens if I refuse? The audit continues, possibly litigation. It won't be pleasant. For them, I said. For everyone, he corrected, including you. I appreciated his honesty, and if I counter, then you define the terms. That night, after the kids were asleep, I wrote my response. I didn't negotiate the number first. I negotiated the structure. I asked for full disclosure of all trust-related accounts for the past 10 years, independent oversight going forward, removal of Lauren from any fiduciary role, a clause preventing retaliation or coercion. And one more thing my lawyer had raised an eyebrow at, but agreed to include. A written acknowledgement. Not an apology, not an admission of guilt, just a statement recognizing that I had been excluded from information and decisions I was legally entitled to be part of. It's symbolic, my lawyer had said. Exactly, I replied. The response went out Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, my phone started ringing. I didn't answer. Lauren left 3 voicemails in quick succession. The first was controlled. The second was angry. The third was quiet, almost pleading. My mother sent a text, please call us. This is getting out of hand. I didn't. On Saturday, my father showed up at my apartment. I saw him through the window as he stood on the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, looking uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. For a moment, I considered not opening the door. Then I did. He didn't step inside. He stood in the doorway like a guest, not a parent. You're asking for too much, he said without preamble. I'm asking for clarity, I replied. This could destroy us. I met his gaze. You were fine with destroying me. He flinched. That's not fair. It's accurate, I said. He exhaled sharply. Lauren made mistakes. But this is punishment. No, I said, this is consequence. He looked past me into the apartment. The kids' shoes by the door. The stack of library books on the table. The quiet life I'd built without them. You've changed, he said. Yes, I said I had to. He hesitated. If you go through with this, there may not be a way back. I nodded. I know. He left without another word. On Monday, the counteroffer was rejected. On Tuesday, the audit expanded again. By Wednesday, one of the business partners filed a separate complaint. Things moved quickly after that, faster than anyone expected. The system, once engaged, did what systems do. It followed procedure, not feelings. Lauren was removed from her role pending investigation. My mother called crying this time, real tears. She said she didn't recognize her family anymore. I almost said I understood. Instead, I said I do, because I finally did recognize it, clearly, without the fog of hope or obligation. Weeks passed. The stress took its toll. There were days I questioned myself. Days I wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd misunderstood something fundamental. Those doubts came late at night, when exhaustion loosened my resolve. But every time I pictured that dinner table, that moment when my mother agreed it was best for me to leave, the doubt quieted. I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing it because I refused to lie anymore. The turning point came quietly. An amended proposal arrived. This time, it included everything I'd asked for, including the acknowledgement. My lawyer called me afterward. "They're conceding," he said, "fully." I closed my eyes. This was the moment I'd imagined for months. The moment where I would feel victorious, powerful, redeemed. What I felt instead was relief, not because I'd won, but because I no longer needed their approval to move forward. I told my lawyer to proceed. That evening, I took my kids out for ice cream. We sat on a bench, sticky and laughing, the sun setting behind us. No one knew what had shifted that day. No one needed to. As we walked home, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Lauren. "I hope this was worth it," she wrote. I didn't reply. Because worth is measured differently when you finally stop trading your dignity for peace. And that lesson, once learned, doesn't unlearn itself. The papers were signed on a gray Tuesday morning. No ceremony, no dramatic meeting, just a quiet exchange of documents between attorneys in offices miles apart. I wasn't there in person. I didn't need to be. I read every page twice, asked 3 questions, then signed my name in steady ink. When I clicked send, nothing exploded. No sense of triumph, no wave of regret. Just a strange calm, like the moment after a long illness, when you realize the fever has finally broken. The acknowledgement was exactly 1 paragraph long. It stated that I had been excluded from information and decision-making related to my grandmother's trust, despite being a named beneficiary, and that this exclusion had caused material and emotional harm. No blame assigned, no excuses offered, just fact. That paragraph mattered more to me than the money. The funds were transferred a week later. I moved most of it into an account my parents and siblings would never have access to. A portion went toward practical things, paying off debt, fixing the car, starting a college fund for each of my kids. The rest I left untouched, not as a safety net, but as proof that I no longer needed to scramble. When you stop scrambling, people notice. My parents stopped calling altogether. Not out of anger, out of something quieter. Shame, maybe. Or the realization that the dynamic they'd relied on was gone for good. Lauren sent one final message. "I never thought you'd do this to us." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. "I didn't do this to you. I stopped covering for you." She never responded. Ethan tried once more. He called late at night, his voice casual in the way men get when they're uncomfortable with vulnerability. "You didn't have to burn everything down," he said. "I didn't," I replied. I walked away from the fire. "You think you're better than us now?" "No," I said. "I think I'm done pretending I'm less." He hung up without saying goodbye. Spring turned into summer. Life settled into a new rhythm. Work was steady. My manager started looping me into decisions instead of just tasks. I didn't overperform anymore. I performed accurately, confidently. That shift alone earned me more respect than years of trying to prove myself ever had. At home, things were quieter too. Not tense quiet, peaceful. My kids stopped asking when we were going to Grandma's house. They stopped noticing the absence because absence had become normal. One evening, as I was sorting laundry, my daughter asked, "Why don't we see your mom anymore?" I folded a shirt carefully before answering. Sometimes I said people don't know how to be kind when they feel afraid. She nodded, satisfied. Children don't need long explanations. They need honesty scaled to their size. In August, a letter arrived from the court. The audit was complete. Findings confirmed irregularities, but no criminal charges were pursued. Fines were issued. Oversight mandated. The family business was restructured under independent management. The consequences were real, just not dramatic. That felt right. I saw my parents once after that. It was at a grocery store of all places. I was comparing prices on cereal when I sensed someone behind me. I turned, and there they were standing too close, looking unsure of their place in my space. My mother's eyes filled instantly. My father nodded stiffly. "Hi," my mother said. "Hi," I replied. She glanced at my cart, at the kids' snacks, at the normalcy of my life. "You look, well." "I am," I said. She hesitated. "We miss you." I didn't doubt that she did, but missing someone and respecting them are not the same thing. "I wish you well," I said. My father opened his mouth and closed it again. For once, he seemed to understand that there was nothing he could say to regain the ground he'd lost. We parted awkwardly like strangers who shared a history neither knew how to acknowledge anymore. That night, I thought about the version of myself who had stood in Lauren's doorway 2 years earlier, holding a sleeping child, wondering what she'd done wrong. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her something simple. It wasn't you. But more than that, I wanted to tell her that silence isn't weakness, that waiting isn't surrender, that sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. The final shift came quietly, the way real change usually does. I stopped checking my phone for messages from them, stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen, stopped hoping for closure from people incapable of offering it. In its place grew something sturdier: self-trust. Not the loud, performative kind. The kind that lets you sleep at night. The kind that allows you to make decisions without polling a room that never had your best interests at heart. By the time fall arrived, I realized something else. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had done its job. It had alerted me to the injustice. It had fueled my resolve. But it wasn't meant to stay. What replaced it wasn't forgiveness. It was boundaries. And boundaries once set don't require constant defense. They just require that you keep choosing yourself even when no one is watching. By the time fall settled in, the story had already hardened into something people told themselves. In my family's version, I had become distant, difficult, changed. Those words traveled quietly through extended relatives, whispered over phone calls I was no longer included in. I didn't hear them directly at first. I felt them in the pauses. In the way invitations stopped coming altogether, not even the performative ones. At first that stung. Then it clarified. I hadn't just stepped out of a role. I had disrupted a hierarchy, and hierarchies don't forgive that easily. The first time I heard it out loud was from my Aunt Claire. She called one evening, her voice overly warm, the way people sound when they've already chosen a side but want to appear neutral. "Your mother's heartbroken," she said after a few minutes of small talk. "She doesn't understand why you've shut everyone out." I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching my kids color at the table. "I didn't shut anyone out," I said. I stepped back. "Well," she replied gently, "sometimes stepping back feels the same as abandonment." That word again, turned neatly in my direction. "Did anyone feel abandoned when I was asked to leave?" I asked. There was a pause. That was different. It always was. I thanked her for calling and ended the conversation before it turned into something uglier. Afterward, I stood there longer than necessary, feeling the familiar pull to explain myself, to justify, to smooth things over. I didn't. That urge was the last remnant of who I used to be. At work, things continued to shift in quieter ways. My supervisor pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if I'd consider leading a small team on a new project. Not because I'd asked, not because I'd campaigned for it, but because, in her words, you don't flinch when things get uncomfortable. I accepted. Leadership, I learned, had nothing to do with authority. It had everything to do with clarity. At home, the kids adjusted too. They grew into the new normal without questioning it. Children are remarkably good at that when adults stop dragging them into unresolved conflicts. Our apartment felt lighter, safer. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was pretending to be. One evening after the kids were asleep, I found an old photo while cleaning out a drawer. It was from years earlier, taken at my parents' house. Lauren and Ethan stood on either side of me, arms around my shoulders. We were all smiling. I studied it longer than I expected. I didn't miss them as people. I missed the idea of what I thought we were. The version of family that only existed as long as I stayed agreeable. That realization hurt in a different way, sharper, cleaner. The next contact came unexpectedly. It was from Mark, my brother-in-law. He emailed late one night, subject line neutral, almost professional. He said he hoped I was well. He said things had been stressful. He said Lauren was having a hard time. Then he said something that caught my attention. She feels like she's lost control of her life. I read that sentence twice. Control. There it was again. The word no one ever said directly, but everyone lived by. I didn't reply. A week later, Lauren sent a message that wasn't angry or accusatory. I don't know how to talk to you anymore, it read. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of it. Neither did I. But only one of us had been punished for trying. I typed a response slowly. I'm not available for conversations that require me to minimize myself to make others comfortable. I deleted it. Then I wrote something simpler. I hope you find peace. I sent it. That was the last message between us. As Thanksgiving approached, the absence became more noticeable. In previous years, my phone would buzz with logistics. Who was bringing what? What time to arrive? Now nothing. The silence was intentional, so I made other plans. I invited a few friends over, single parents, neighbors, people who understood chosen family without needing it explained. We cooked together imperfectly. The kids ran between rooms. Someone spilled gravy on the tablecloth and laughed instead of apologizing. At one point, I stepped into the bathroom just to breathe. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I was grateful. Later that night, after everyone left and the dishes were stacked in the sink, I sat alone on the couch and thought about the arc of the past 2 years. The job loss, the dinner, the exclusion, the discovery, the audit, the signatures. At no point had I raised my voice. At no point had I demanded anything emotionally. I hadn't begged. I hadn't pleaded. I hadn't tried to be understood. I had simply stopped participating in my own erasure. That was the part no one had prepared me for. People expect revenge to look explosive, public, satisfying in obvious ways. This didn't look like that. It looked like restraint, paperwork, silence, distance. It looked like choosing not to show up where you're not respected, even when doing so costs you the illusion of belonging. A few days after Thanksgiving, I received a notification from my bank. The final portion of the settlement funds had cleared. Everything was complete. I closed the app and set my phone down. For the first time in years, there was nothing pending. No waiting, no loose ends. Just forward motion. I didn't know then that the hardest part was still coming. Not the legal aftermath, not the family fallout, but the moment when I would be tested one last time. Not by them, by myself. The test didn't come loudly. It arrived the way most real tests do, disguised as something familiar. Something that sounded like reconciliation. It was early December when my mother emailed me. Not called, not texted. An email careful and composed, like she'd drafted it with someone watching over her shoulder. She wrote that she had been doing a lot of thinking. That age had a way of clarifying priorities. That family mattered more than money or misunderstandings. She said she wanted to meet just the two of us. No lawyers, no agendas. I just want my daughter back, she wrote. I read it 3 times. A year earlier, that sentence would have undone me. It would have pulled at every old instinct, every thread of obligation woven into me since childhood. But now it landed differently. Because nowhere in the email did she mention what had actually happened. No acknowledgement of the dinner, no recognition of the exclusion, no mention of the trust, the audit, the fallout. Just a gentle reframing, as if the conflict had been a mutual misunderstanding that time could smooth over. I didn't respond right away. That weekend, I took the kids to the park. We walked the trail behind the playground, the one that looped past bare trees and frozen patches of mud. My son ran ahead, kicking leaves. My daughter held my hand, swinging it back and forth. Grandma doesn't like us anymore, she said suddenly. I stopped walking. Why would you think that, I asked. She never comes, my daughter said, and she doesn't call. I crouched down to her level. Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to fix things, I said. But that doesn't mean you're not loved. She considered that, then nodded. Children accept truth when it's offered plainly. That night, after they were asleep, I replied to my mother. I thanked her for reaching out. I told her I was open to meeting under one condition. That we talk honestly about what happened, I wrote. Not to argue, just to acknowledge reality. I sent it and set my phone down, feeling a familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear. Anticipation. Her reply came the next morning. She agreed. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes. Neutral territory. She arrived early. I arrived on time. She stood when she saw me, as if unsure whether to hug me. I nodded instead. We sat. She looked older up close, thinner. Her hands shook slightly as she wrapped them around her mug. I miss you, she said. I know, I replied. She sighed. I don't know how things got so out of control. I took a breath. They didn't get out of control, I said. They followed a pattern. She frowned. What pattern? I told her, calmly, without accusation. I described how decisions had always been made without me, how my value in the family shifted depending on my circumstances, how love had felt conditional. She listened, eyes glossy, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she reached across the table, placing her hand near mine without touching it. We did our best, she said. I withdrew my hand slightly. Your best still hurt me. She looked startled, like she hadn't expected that answer. I thought, she said slowly, that you were stronger than this. That was the moment. The moment the test revealed itself. Strength to her had always meant endurance, silence, compliance, the ability to absorb pain without disrupting the family narrative. I leaned back in my chair. I was strong, I said. That's why this stopped. Her face crumpled. So what now? I considered the question carefully. Now, I said, we figure out what a relationship looks like without control. She blinked. I don't understand. I won't be managed, I said. I won't be minimized. And I won't pretend things didn't happen to keep the peace. Tears slipped down her cheeks. You're punishing me. No, I said. I'm protecting myself. We sat in silence after that. The cafe noise filled the space between us. Cups clinked. Someone laughed nearby. Finally, she nodded. I don't know if I can do that. I stood. Then this is as far as we go. She reached for my sleeve. Please. I gently stepped back. Walking out of that cafe, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not grief. Release. Because the final illusion had fallen away. The belief that if I just explained myself better, loved harder, waited longer, things would change. They wouldn't. And that wasn't my failure. That evening, I wrote in a notebook I'd started keeping after everything began to unravel. I didn't write about anger or betrayal. I wrote about boundaries, about how love without respect is not love at all, about how choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop disappearing. As Christmas approached, I felt lighter. Not because the season was joyful, but because I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment anymore. I decorated the apartment with the kids. We hung mismatched ornaments. We baked cookies badly. We laughed at the mess. On Christmas Eve, after they were asleep, I sat by the window and watched the snow fall. 2 years earlier, I had been asked to leave a house where I thought I belonged. Now I was exactly where I needed to be, and I knew with quiet certainty that whatever came next, I would meet it on my own terms. That knowledge was the real inheritance, and no one could take it from me. The year turned without ceremony. No countdowns, no resolutions, just a slow, steady slide into January, the kind that makes you take inventory whether you want to or not. At work, my project wrapped earlier than expected. My team performed well, clean execution, no drama. My supervisor mentioned my name in a meeting I wasn't even in, recommending me for a broader role. I found out later through a colleague the praise delivered secondhand without strings attached. That mattered. At home, the kids settled into routines that no longer revolved around waiting. Waiting for calls, waiting for visits, waiting for adults to show up emotionally. They adapted in ways that reminded me how much of what we call loyalty is actually learned anxiety. I stopped checking the mailbox with a sense of dread, stopped scanning emails for subtext. The nervous system remembers long after the danger has passed, but it can also relearn safety. Then in late January, the past found another way in. It was an envelope without a return address, thick, official. Inside was a court notice. My parents were contesting part of the trust settlement, not the financial terms. The acknowledgement. I sat at the table for a long time, the paper unfolded in front of me. My hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race. I felt tired. They weren't trying to get money back. They weren't trying to undo the oversight. They were trying to erase the record. The written confirmation that they had excluded me. That told me everything. I called my lawyer. They can try, he said, but it's weak, and it will reopen scrutiny. Why would they do this, I asked. Because facts are harder to live with than consequences, he replied. The hearing was set for March. I didn't tell anyone outside my immediate circle, not because I was ashamed, but because I refused to let it dominate my life again. Still, it weighed on me, not as fear, as grief. Not for the family I had lost, for the one I never actually had. As the date approached, my mother reached out again. This time her tone was different, sharper, less restrained. You didn't have to humiliate us, she said on the voicemail. I deleted it without listening to the end. Lauren sent a message that read, "You could end this any time." She was right. All I had to do was agree that what happened hadn't really happened. I didn't respond. The hearing itself was brief, procedural. I attended via video sitting at my desk, with the kids' artwork taped to the wall behind me. My parents were there in person. I recognized the courtroom from photos, wood-paneled, formal, unforgiving. Their attorney argued that the acknowledgement was unnecessary, inflammatory, damaging to reputations. My lawyer argued that it was factual, mutually agreed upon, and essential to the settlement. The judge listened, asked a few questions, flipped through documents. Then she spoke. "This court does not exist to protect feelings," she said. "It exists to uphold agreements." The request was denied. I closed my laptop and sat back, the weight finally lifting in a way it hadn't before. It was over. That evening, I took the kids out for pizza. Nothing fancy. A small celebration they didn't need to understand fully. They laughed. They argued over toppings. They were happy. Later, after they were asleep, I allowed myself to feel it. The sadness, the finality. Not the kind that overwhelms. The kind that settles. I thought about my parents driving home from that courtroom. About Lauren pacing her kitchen. About the narrative they would tell themselves now that there was no one left to convince. And then I thought about myself. About the woman who had once believed love meant compliance. Who had mistaken endurance for strength. Who had stayed silent to preserve connections that were never mutual. She was gone. In her place stood someone quieter, clearer, less willing to bend. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was my mother. "I hope you're happy," she wrote. I stared at the screen, then set the phone down. Happiness, I'd learned, wasn't something you could be shamed out of choosing. It was something you built when you stopped negotiating your worth. That afternoon, I updated my resume. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to. I applied for a position I would have talked myself out of a year earlier. I didn't hear back right away, but I wasn't waiting the way I used to. Because waiting implies someone else controls the outcome. And they didn't. Not anymore. The offer came in February on a day that felt aggressively ordinary. I was in the middle of folding laundry when my phone buzzed. An email notification. Subject line, "Next steps." No exclamation point, no drama. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it. They wanted to move forward. Not a promotion in name only. A real role. Expanded scope. More responsibility. More money. A seat at tables I'd never been invited to before. I sat down on the edge of the bed and read the email twice, then once more slowly. There was no rush deadline, no pressure, just an invitation. A year ago, I would have panicked, wondered if I was ready, asked for opinions, sought reassurance from people who had never shown up for me when it mattered. This time I forwarded it to my lawyer. Not because it was legal, because he had seen me at my most compromised and still treated me with respect. "Looks solid," he replied. "Congratulations." That was enough. I accepted. The shift at work was immediate. Not in how people treated me, but in how I moved through the space. I spoke less, but more precisely. I stopped apologizing for taking time to think. I stopped over-explaining decisions that didn't require consensus. No one pushed back. I wondered how much of the resistance I'd felt before had come from others, and how much had come from the way I'd been trained to doubt myself. Around the same time, the family silence thickened into something almost tangible. I heard through distant relatives that my parents were keeping to themselves, that Lauren had stepped back from community events she used to dominate, that people were whispering not because of scandal, but because absence always raises questions. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt done. Then one afternoon, a package arrived. No return address, just my name written in handwriting I recognized immediately. Inside was a small wooden box, the kind my grandmother used to keep on her dresser. I hadn't seen it in years. My chest tightened as I opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some unopened, some yellowed with age, all addressed to me. They were written over years, notes my grandmother had written and never sent. Observations, reflections, fragments of thought. The handwriting wavered in the later ones. One letter dated shortly before she died stood out. "I see how they look at you," she had written. "I see how they rely on your silence. If you ever read this, it means you stopped protecting them." I sat there for a long time, the box open in my lap. This wasn't revenge. This was validation. Tucked beneath the letters was a single page, a copy of a document I'd already seen in the audit. The original trust amendment. In the margin in my grandmother's handwriting were 4 words. "For when she's ready." I closed the box gently. That night, I cried for the first time in months. Not out of pain, out of release. The kind that comes when something unspoken is finally acknowledged, even if the person who said it is no longer there. The next week, my father called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. His voice sounded tired, smaller. "We need to talk," he said. I considered the request carefully. "No," I replied. "We don't." A pause. "Is that really it?" "Yes," he sighed. "I never thought you'd walk away." "I didn't walk away," I said. "I stopped chasing." He hung up without another word. Spring edged closer. The days grew longer. The light shifted. With it came a sense of expansion I hadn't felt in years. I started making plans, real ones, not contingency plans, not backup plans. I looked at schools, neighborhoods, possibilities. One evening, as I tucked my kids into bed, my son asked, "Are we going to be okay?" I brushed his hair back gently. "We already are," I said. And I meant it, because okay isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of self-respect. And that once earned doesn't need anyone else's permission to exist. By March, the quiet had settled into something permanent. Not the fragile quiet that comes from people avoiding each other, but the kind that follows a decision fully made. The kind that no longer asks to be revisited. The new role at work came with travel. Nothing glamorous, short flights, conference rooms that all looked the same. But each trip reinforced something important. I was trusted. Not because I was agreeable, not because I stayed late or said yes to everything, but because I delivered without drama. On one of those trips, sitting alone in a hotel room, I realized how much of my old life had been shaped by anticipating reactions. My parents' moods, Lauren's expectations, Ethan's judgments. I'd lived as if my choices were provisional, subject to revision if someone else disapproved. That reflex was gone. It didn't vanish overnight. It faded slowly, like a muscle that finally stopped clenching after years of tension. When I came home from that trip, there was another message waiting. This one wasn't from my parents or my siblings. It was from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. "I heard what happened," she wrote. "I just wanted you to know. I wish I'd done what you did." I stared at that sentence longer than I expected. There it was, the part no one ever says out loud, that these dynamics don't just affect one person, they ripple. They teach everyone else what happens when you step out of line. I wrote back a simple reply. "It's not too late." She didn't respond, but I hoped she'd read it more than once. A few weeks later, my mother sent one final email. Not an apology, not an accusation, a summary. She wrote about how difficult the year had been, about embarrassment, about feeling judged by others, about how she never imagined her family would end up like this. There was one line that stood out. "I hope one day you understand why we did what we did." I closed the email without replying, because understanding had never been the problem. I understood exactly why they did what they did. They chose control over connection, appearance over honesty, comfort over fairness. What they couldn't accept was that I no longer agreed to play along. That same week, the company finalized a long-term contract tied to my new role. Stability, predictability, options. I signed without hesitation. Signing documents used to terrify me. They felt like commitments I might regret, traps I hadn't fully thought through. Now they felt like markers, evidence that I was building something on my own terms. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out old files, I found a journal from years earlier. Back when I was still married, still trying to keep everything together. I flipped through the pages. So many entries about being tired, about feeling invisible, about trying harder. I closed it gently. That version of me had done the best she could with what she knew at the time. But she wasn't meant to stay there. The real test came unexpectedly, the way they often do. Lauren showed up at my work. She didn't have an appointment. She didn't announce herself. She appeared at the front desk with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. When the receptionist called to ask if I knew her, I said yes. And then I said, "Tell her I'm unavailable." The receptionist hesitated. "She says it's important." "I'm sure it feels that way to her," I replied, "but I'm not available." Lauren waited in the lobby for nearly an hour before leaving. I didn't see her. I didn't need to. That moment mattered more than any conversation we could have had. Because boundaries aren't proven in dialogue. They're proven in action. That evening after dinner, my daughter asked why I seemed lighter. "You're smiling more," she said. I thought about it. "I'm not carrying things that aren't mine anymore," I told her. She nodded, satisfied with that explanation, and went back to her drawing. As spring fully arrived, the world outside mirrored what had already happened inside me. Things opened, shifted, moved forward. I stopped thinking of the past as something unfinished. There was nothing left to resolve. No final confrontation. No dramatic reconciliation. Just acceptance. Acceptance that some people will never see you clearly because doing so would require them to face themselves. And that's not your responsibility. The story I once thought I needed closure on had already ended. What lay ahead was something else entirely, not a reaction. A life. And I was finally ready to live it without looking over my shoulder. There wasn't a single moment when everything clicked into place. No cinematic ending. No final confrontation that wrapped things up neatly. What came instead was a gradual, almost imperceptible shift, like waking up one morning and realizing the pain you've been compensating for is gone. I noticed it first in small ways. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head while driving, stopped imagining what I'd say if my mother called again, or if Lauren showed up unannounced, or if someone asked me why I'd let things go this far. The scripts dissolved because the audience no longer mattered. My life became quieter but fuller. Mornings were predictable in a way that felt grounding, not dull. Coffee, breakfast, the kids arguing over shoes. The ordinary chaos of a household that wasn't bracing for impact anymore. I stopped measuring my worth against someone else's approval. I started measuring it by how steady my hands felt when I made decisions. At work, I was invited into a strategy meeting with senior leadership, not as an observer, as a contributor. I spoke when I had something to say. I stayed silent when I didn't. No one questioned my presence. After the meeting, a colleague leaned over and said, "You don't seem rattled by anything." I thought about that on the drive home. Rattled had been my default state for years. Waiting for disapproval. Waiting for correction. Waiting for the invisible line I was always about to cross. That line was gone. One afternoon in late spring, I took the kids to look at a house. Nothing extravagant. Just a modest place in a neighborhood with trees and sidewalks and a park within walking distance. The kind of place that felt stable without being performative. The kids ran from room to room claiming imaginary spaces before we'd even left the driveway. On the way home, my son asked, "Is this really ours?" "Not yet," I said, "but it could be." He smiled like that was enough. And it was. The closing process was straightforward. Paperwork, inspections, a signature that didn't make my stomach drop this time. When I held the keys in my hand, I felt something settle deep in my chest. This wasn't a symbol of success. It was a symbol of agency. I didn't tell my family, not out of spite, out of clarity. There are chapters of your life that don't require witnesses from earlier volumes. The last message I ever received from my mother came a few weeks later. It was short. "I hope you found what you were looking for." I read it once, then I deleted it. Because what I'd been looking for wasn't something she could give. It was the right to choose myself without apology. That summer we moved. The kids adjusted faster than I did. They always do. New rooms, new routines, new friends. I watched them settle into this version of life with an ease that confirmed I'd made the right call long before logic ever could. One evening after the boxes were unpacked and the house finally felt like ours, I sat alone on the back steps and thought about the dinner that had started all of this. The moment I'd been asked to leave, the humiliation, the silence, the certainty that I had failed in some fundamental way. I understood now that being excluded wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a consequence of their need for control. They needed me small so they could feel secure. They needed my silence to maintain their version of the story. When I stopped complying, the structure cracked. That wasn't revenge. That was inevitability. I don't hate them. I don't wish them harm. I don't fantasize about apologies that will never come. I also don't chase closure from people who benefit from withholding it. What I've learned is this: family can be the first place you lose your sense of self if you're not careful. Love can quietly become leverage. And being understanding can cost you more than being honest ever will. The turning point in my life wasn't when they begged me for help. It was when I realized I didn't need to rescue anyone to prove my value. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to explain. I needed to choose myself once clearly, and then keep choosing myself even when it was uncomfortable. Especially when it was uncomfortable. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, here's the part people rarely say out loud. Walking away doesn't mean you're cold. It means you're done setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge is refusing to be controlled by the same dynamics that once broke you. The tables don't turn with noise. They turn the moment you stop sitting at them. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through your own version of silence exclusion or quiet betrayal, take a moment to sit with that recognition. You're not alone, and you're not wrong for wanting more. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about boundaries, dignity, and choosing yourself when it costs you everything familiar, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Because the moment you reclaim your voice, your life doesn't end. It finally begins.